in the age when the celestial rivers still ran gold. When the gods walked among mortals wrapped in mortal flesh, and the great dynasties of Aryavarth rose and fell like tides against the eternal shore. There was a city, Suryagad, city of the Sunday fortress of the Vajrabhangsh dynasty, seated upon the banks of the sacred Chandravahini river, where the waters bend south and catch the light of evening like a mirror held up to heaven. A city of warriors and scholars and merchants and poets. A city where the conch shell prayers rang every morning from 100 temple towers, and the fragrance of incense drifted through every lane from the highest palace terrace to the smallest roadside shrine. And in this city, in this age, two souls were about to collide with the force of destiny's celestial account. The fruit. The settling of many lifetimes. Her name was Sri Shanvika. Shri, to those who loved her. She was the fourth daughter of the Sengupta clan, the great warrior house whose battle banners had never once been lowered before an enemy. Her father, the supreme commander Vikramaditya Sengupta, was a man whose name alone could silence a battlefield. Her brothers were legends in their own right. And her second brother had just returned, barely a fortnight past, from the northern frontier, crowned in dust and glory and the quiet satisfaction of a man who has held the line and brought his soldiers home. It should have been a season of light, of marigold garlands and lamp festivals and 7 nights of celebration. But fate, that most indifferent of all weavers, had already begun to pull upon a different thread. Into the Sengupta household arrived what no warrior fears on the battlefield, but every family dreads in peacetime. A royal command, sealed with the mark of the emperor himself, bearing the weight of imperial decree and the warmth of neither compassion nor apology. In recognition of Soumitra Sengupta's great service to the empire, the emperor declared the Sengupta family was to receive a singular honor. The fourth daughter of their house, Sri Shanvika, was hereby betrothed to the seventh prince of the Vajrabhangsh. The seventh prince, Arudra. The name fell upon the courtyard like a stone dropped into still water. And the ripples would not stop. Everyone in Suryagad knew the name. The bards dared not sing of him too loudly. The royal physicians had given him no more than 2 years to live. The emperor himself had banished his own seventh son from the palace walls, declaring the boy's presence an ill omen upon the throne. And the whispers that travelled from the market to the inner chambers to the royal assembly, spoke of a man whose darkness had no floor, of cruelty without boundary, of a prince who had lost whatever softness he may once have held. Whether the darkest of these stories were truth or poison, none dared verify. The Sengupta family stood at the edge of an abyss. To refuse the emperor's command meant the destruction of the entire clan. To comply meant sending their most beloved daughter into that shadow. Her third sister wept and offered to go in her place. Her brothers raged. Her mother could not eat for 3 days. But Shri, who had been raised in the quiet inner garden with flowers and old manuscripts and the fragrance of rain on warm earth, Shri looked at the decree spread across the courtyard floor, and she made her decision. For the Sengupta clan, I will go. Either I live, or I die having kept my duty. His name, Arudra, meant the teardrop of the sky. That red star which portends storms, which portends upheaval, which burns brightest in the season of rain. He was 24 years old. He had been banished from the palace at 17, when the physicians first delivered their verdict. He had survived in his own palace, cold, vast, stripped of all warmth, by making himself into something that could not be hurt, because it had decided long ago that it did not care. On the night of the wedding ceremony, he stood at the palace gates by torchlight and watched the bridal procession arrive. His advisor had warned him. This bride was likely a spy. the emperor's eyes placed inside his own house. There were political knives everywhere, even wrapped in wedding silk. And then she stepped out from the palanquin. Shri, who had walked directly into an assassin lurking in the dark outer corridor, who had immediately, on pure instinct, pressed the hem of her own wedding garment against the wound on his arm, who had looked up at him with eyes that held fear and determination in equal measure, and said with a calm she had clearly borrowed from somewhere deeper than the moment, "Kill me if you will. I came here for my family. But I look at your eyes, my prince, and your eyes do not lie." Something shifted in Arudra that night. He did not hurt her. He did not dismiss her. He gave her rooms in his cold palace and told her curtly that she was free to do as she pleased, so long as she did not interfere in his affairs. He did not tell her that he lay awake that night, turning her words over and over in the silence. Shri had a nature like a river. Patient. Persistent. Capable of cutting through granite given enough time. She looked at the bleak, flowerless courtyards of Arudra's palace, the place that had known no warmth in years, and felt something simple and resolute take root in her chest. She asked him, with the directness that would become her greatest weapon against his walls, whether she might plant flowers in the empty garden. He stared at her as though she had asked whether the moon tasted of tamarind. She planted the garden anyway. In the city, she found an abandoned property in the Bazaar quarter and transformed it into something she called Kamlavati, the Lotus Lane. A workshop where she taught widows and women fallen on hard times the art of crafting natural perfumes and flower-pressed pigments that the finest ladies of Suryagarh paid fortunes to obtain. She gave them a skill. She gave them an income. She gave them back the quiet dignity that hardship had stripped away. Arudra followed her there one afternoon, in disguise. Not yet willing to admit even to himself why he had come. He stood in the doorway and watched her demonstrate the art of pressing lotus petals, laughing with women who had long forgotten how to laugh. And beneath everything he saw, the physician's voice echoed, "Not yet 2 years, my prince, not yet 2 years," and something in him hurt in a way the poison had never managed. He was beginning to understand. She was not a spy. She was not a pawn. She was something he had no framework for. She was someone who made you feel, simply by being present, that the room was worth being in. But even the most fragile new understanding cannot hold still the wheel of duty. Word reached Arudra that his elder brother, the first Prince Samarendraditya, had been appointed to oversee disaster relief in the drought-struck province of Shivarpuram. And that Samarendraditya was selling the imperial relief stores to grain merchants, substituting inferior grain, pocketing the difference, while thousands starved. Arudra's first instinct was the cold arithmetic of a survivor. He had been playing this game since childhood. What did the starving people of Shivarpuram have to do with him? It was Shri who changed the calculation. She did not argue strategy. She did not deploy logic. She went very still, and she told him something she had never told anyone, of a journey made in childhood through a famine-struck province, holding her father's hand, watching families come apart in the extremity of hunger, of faces that had stopped hoping. She said, if someone had stretched out a hand in the dark to those people, just one hand, the road ahead would have had light in it again. There was a long silence. Then Arudra, the man who had long since stopped pretending to be benevolent, who had convinced himself he felt nothing for anyone, quietly asked his general for the most detailed map of the Shivarpuram granary roads. What followed was a masterwork of covert strategy. In a single coordinated night action, his forces combined with the Sengupta household guards who came without hesitation when Shri called. He intercepted the corrupted shipments. He redirected genuine imperial grain to the starving province. he secured documentary evidence against the first prince's network. When the emperor's commendation arrived before the morning dew had dried, when the first prince's allies lay exposed, the court of Suryagarh was forced to acknowledge what some had always feared. The cursed, dying, banished seventh prince had outmaneuvered them all. Listen to your wife and receive the blessing you were not expecting. The fifth prince Singhadev was a man of appetites and no patience. He had watched Arudra's rising fortunes with dangerous eyes. And when Shri was returning from a visit to her family, accompanied only by her handmaid and an old retainer, his assassins were waiting in the fig grove along the Palanquin road. Shri had heard soldiers speak of ambush. She had never understood until that moment what it truly meant for every sound to become an enemy. The rustle of leaves turning to drawn bowstrings. The creak of the palanquin turning to advancing swords. The carriers fled. Her handmaid screamed. And Shri stepped out onto the road alone, with nothing in her hands but a stone box of hawthorn sweets she had been bringing home for Arudra. She faced 5 armed men with the absolute knowledge that she was about to die. She did not die. Arudra had been following her. He would later claim he merely had business on the same road. Shri would always know this was untrue. He had been following her because the anxiety of knowing she was outside his walls had made the day unworkable. He appeared at the edge of the grove like a force of nature, sword already drawn, face perfectly calm in the way of men who have long made peace with violence, and dismantled the ambush with the efficiency of a general who had once commanded the empire's forward battle line. Afterward, in the dust of the road, Shri sat holding the stone box, cracked now, dented, but intact. Arudra knelt before her and checked her hands for trembling. She told him the hawthorn sweets had gone cold. That they would not taste as good now they had been rained on. That she would bring him more next time. He looked at her for a long time. He began to say something. And then he stopped. He rose. He sheathed his sword. And he told her to wash the dust from her face. But she had heard the beginning of the unfinished sentence. And she held it carefully, the way you hold a new flame in wind. The great physician Kaushikacharya had served the royal court for 40 years. He had seen every poison that cunning could devise. And when he finally decoded the true source of Arudra's wasting illness, a compound venom introduced years ago through slow contact with doctored incense in the palace temple, he wept. Not because the prince would die. All things die. He wept because the last ingredient needed for the antidote, the blossom of a rare flower called Shamakshi, which bloomed only once in 30 years on the cliff faces of the Himalayan ranges, had been exhausted from all known stores. The last specimen had been used 3 winters past. The next bloom was decades away. 6 months. Perhaps less, if Arudra pushed himself. That was what remained. Arudra received this news alone, at midnight, in the garden Shri had planted. He sat among the jasmine vines and the champa trees for a long time. He was not a man who had ever indulged in fear. Fear requires a future to be afraid of losing. But sitting there, in that garden that had been dead stone before she came, breathing the fragrance of living things she had coaxed into being from nothing, he acknowledged for the first time, with the honesty of a man who no longer has the luxury of self-deception. He very much did not want to leave. He told no one except his general and his physician. He would not let Shri know. Not because he doubted her strength, but because he knew, with the particular precision of a man who had spent months studying her every expression, that she would waste every remaining hour in grief. And their time was already too short. The posting to Vajrangiri, the northern frontier city where the eldest princess Vishwamohini held court, arrived dressed as an honor. In truth, it was the emperor's strategy, removing Arudra from the capital as the first prince's case unfolded and placing him within reach of Vishwamohini. A woman volatile, unpredictable, and known to tend her famous gardens with something darker than ordinary soil. Vishwamohini. Given at 15 in political alliance to the steppe king Helianath of the northern tribes. Widowed 3 years ago when rival clans cut him down. Returned to Suryagarh carrying something that was not quite grief and not quite fury, but harder and stranger than either. When Shri received the eldest princess's invitation, she went alone. Arudra had gone ahead on administrative duties. She would not shelter behind his name. Vishwamohini received her in a garden of extraordinary, unsettling beauty. She extinguished all the torches deliberately to disorient her guest, then relit them and declared Shri's composure charming. A test. Shri, who had faced 5 armed men on a palanquin road, simply smoothed her garment and waited for the game to end. And in the long evening that followed, two women found in each other something they had not expected. A mirror. Both had been used as pieces on the Vajrabhanksh board. Both given to men by imperial command. Both handed lives they had not chosen. Vishwamohini told her, late in the night, with the honesty of women who have stopped pretending, that she had denied for years having loved Helianath. That she had convinced herself the marriage was only obligation. But she remembered everything about him. Every small thing. And she had only understood the truth of what she felt after he was gone. Shri went home in the pre-dawn dark, and she thought about Arudra. His midnight silence in the jasmine garden. The unfinished sentence on the road. The way he watched her, when he thought she could not see, with the expression of a man confronting something for which he has no words. She thought, I do not want to find out I loved him only after he is gone. The boy arrived in Vajrangri like a riddle the gods had thrown into an already complicated story. He had stolen Shri's purse in the bazaar with the professional efficiency of a child who has been surviving alone for some time. She ran after him not with anger but with concern. And she caught him not by speed, but because he stopped, turned, and looked at her with an expression of such complex calculation that it stopped her completely. He had been looking for her specifically. His name, the name he gave, was Lin. His true name was Celine. He was perhaps 10 years old. His father had told him before dying, find the Sengupta family. They are good people. Trust them. Against his chest, bound in cloth and sacred thread, he carried a jade pendant bearing a royal seal. The seal of the second Prince Vikrasena, who had died 4 years ago under circumstances the court accepted as illness and which Arudra had never quite believed. Celine was the second prince's son, the eldest grandson of the emperor himself. He had been surviving in the margins of the empire since a massacre had killed every member of his household. A massacre ordered, it was becoming devastatingly clear, by the fourth prince Samarendraditya. Shri brought the boy home without a second thought. She introduced him to Arudra as a distant family relation with cheerful invention that left the General Muktakesh speechless. She installed him in the palace alongside the other children of the household as though collecting motherless children was simply part of her ordinary daily practice. Arudra watched all of this. He thought, she is going to fill this palace with life, and then I am going to die, and who will water the jasmine after? The fourth prince Samarendraditya had spent years building toward one thing: the throne. He had constructed alliances with the steppe tribes beyond the northern passes. He had eliminated rivals he could not buy. He had poisoned the emperor's ear against every sibling who threatened him. That it was he who had originally commissioned the slow poison in Arudra's temple incense was a secret he had believed would follow him safely to his grave. He had not accounted for Shri. He had not accounted for the boy Celine. He had not accounted for the fact that when Arudra finally had something worth fighting for, he became a different and far more dangerous kind of warrior. When Samarandraditya moved his forces against the road carrying Celine back to the capital, mistaking it for a routine convoy, he moved them into a trap. Arudra's forces, the Sengupta clan soldiers, and arriving like the answer to a prayer shouted at the heavens, the border regiment of General Vikramaditya Sengupta himself, who had not been willing to let his daughter ride into this particular storm without an army behind her. Three rivers of the same current, converging at the same moment. Vishwamohini, who had her own reckoning with the fourth prince for the death of Helianath, handled the rest with the efficiency of a woman who had been waiting 4 years for this exact moment. When the dust settled, when Celine was confirmed alive, the evidence complete, the Empress herself exposed as the conspiracy's architect, Arudra stood in the courtyard of the Vajrangiri palace and allowed himself one moment of simple, clean satisfaction. He had done what he came to do. He had given the empire a clean path forward. He had fulfilled his duty. Then his knees buckled. Shri caught him. She always caught him. Her hands were flour-dusted, she had been making something in the palace kitchen, impossibly, as though catastrophe were merely an interruption to a normal day. She put her arms around him before he could ask her not to. She held him up. And she said into his ear, with the quiet fury of a woman who has decided she is done with accepting loss. Do not you dare. Do not you dare leave me here. I planted that garden for both of us to grow old in. The emperor received the boy Celine. The whole truth was spoken aloud in the imperial court for the first time, of the poison, the conspiracy, the murdered second prince, the decades of manipulation. The emperor, who had spent a lifetime using his children as instruments and believed himself beyond surprise, sat very still for a very long time. He thought of a 17-year-old boy he had banished from the palace because a physician told him the boy's illness was bad luck. He thought of all the years that decision had cost. He thought of the things a father can tell himself when he is afraid and the price those stories eventually demand. He deployed the full weight of imperial resources in the search for the Shamakshi flower. Every physician in the realm, every mountain hermitage, every ancient botanical record in the imperial library. The flower was found. Not on the Himalayan cliffs as the old texts described, but in the courtyard garden of a reclusive mountain sage in the Sharda Valley. A single ancient plant, tended for decades, never harvested. The sage said simply, I was told in a dream, 7 years ago, that someone would come for it. I have been watering it since then. Take it. The physician Kaushikacharya worked through 3 sunrises without sleeping. The antidote worked. Slowly. Uncertainly. With nights that held no guarantee. But it worked. On the night of the Deva Jayanti, the great festival of the gods' victory over the forces of time and forgetting, the Chandravahini river was covered from bank to bank with floating lamps. The city of Suryagarh had dressed itself in marigold and fire. Children ran along the river steps releasing lanterns into the current. The air was thick with incense and the sound of conch shell prayers and the particular joy of a city that has come through something terrible and arrived, against the odds, at the other side. In the courtyard of what had once been the coldest and most impersonal palace in the imperial quarter, the jasmine had been replanted 3 times. The champa tree had grown tall enough to shade the eastern wall. The daffodils Arudra had once requested, he who had never in his life cared about flowers before a specific woman arrived and made caring about them seem like the most natural thing in the world, stood in orderly rows along the path to the gate. Celine sat on the courtyard steps with the child Yuan, teaching her to fold marigold petals into floating lamp shapes. He was 12 years old now. He looked, everyone said, like his father. He had his mother's eyes. He was learning, slowly, what it meant to have a home. Inside the palace, she was making Hawthorn sweet preserves. She had developed, over the course of a very eventful year, a clear and unshakable theory that the best response to any difficulty, large or small, was to ensure there was always something good to come home to. The smell of hawthorn and jaggery filled the palace corridors like a prayer answered. Arutha stood in the doorway between the garden and the inner hall and watched her. He was thinner than he had been before the illness. The poison had left faint marks upon him that would not entirely fade. But his eyes were clear. And the shadow that had lived in them since childhood, that particular shadow formed in a person who has been alone too long and convinced themselves they prefer it, had finally, irrevocably, loosened its grip. She looked up and saw him watching. She knew his silences now. Which were storms. Which was simply him being present. This was the second kind. She held out the wooden spoon. He crossed the courtyard. He tasted the preserve with the gravity of a man performing a sacred rite. He said, "More jaggery." She said, "You always say that." He said, "It always needs more jaggery." Outside, the lamps moved down the Chandravahini river like a galaxy of small suns. Each one carrying some prayer, some grief, some gratitude, toward the sea. The sky was the deep vermilion of the sacred mark. That color which means, in the ancient tongue, both auspiciousness and the willingness to place the mark of commitment upon your forehead and mean it. In the garden, Shree's jasmine opened its white flowers into the festival night. Each one shaped like a small star. The fragrance rising, dispersing across the city, across the river steps and the bazaars and the palace walls and the water, until it was part of everything. Until it was indistinguishable from all the other living things that had somehow, despite the odds, made it through the dark and into bloom.